Good evening, everyone. My name is Clarence White. I am the Associate Director here at the Eastside Freedom Library. Thanks for joining us virtually. We have many events here at the Eastside Freedom Library, and those events are usually really great and important conversations. And I have been speaking with and in conversation with the people who are joining us this evening for tonight's event, and it promises to be a really good one. So having said that, tonight we have Anni Liu with us, who is the author of the collection of poetry, Border Vista. It is the winner of the 2021 Lexi Rudensky First Book Prize. Annie is a mentor or mentee of Ross Gay, who said about this work in Anni Liu's astonishing first book. We are a witness to a wandering through all kinds of borders. And I think we are going to be wandering through many topics in conversation tonight that I think will be illuminating, make us think, and get us closer to a truer narrative about the space we live in. Border Vista immediately narrates the experience of being undocumented or precariously documented in America in poems that consider migration as an ongoing process rather than a finite event. Anni Liu writes exquisitely and on fear, useful and paranoid, and agency, loneliness, and the way the violence of the carceral state shapes our most intimate relationships to each other and to the land. And I think many of the things that we bring into our conversation tonight will address that. Again, thank you all for being here tonight. We have a lot of events that happen here at the Eastside Freedom Library, so I'm glad that you're joining us for this important conversation. Also coming up on Tuesday the 31st, Brown Body, which is a dance company that is of people from the African diaspora who are holding presence on ice, will be presenting a conversation in anticipation of their work, Tracing Sacred Steps. So that is Tuesday night, either on Zoom or on our lawn. We have an event coming up the following weekend, production happening on our lawn called the Burning Truth Project. So that's an outdoor performance. Maybe you can join us for that. Again, I want to mention, thank you for being here. I want to mention that we're going to open things up for questions later on. We hope you will hold your questions, and at some point we'll have you put them in the chat, but we'll probably do that around 8 o'clock. But thanks again for joining us. And with that, I am going to hand this off. I think Sagirah is going to read something for us. So Sagirah, take it away.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sagirah Shahid. I'm going to read a statement on land acknowledgement that is informed by the Native Governance Center. I'm also going to just talk about some of the things that I think a lot of us have on our bodies and minds and hearts on this evening. So we're streaming, at least I'm streaming in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Minnesota is the homeland of the Dakota people. The Dakota people have lived here for many thousands of years. This is also the homeland of, or the people who reside here are also Anishinaabe. And there are many different indigenous peoples and native nations that reside in Minnesota and have tons of contributions to this region of the world. I want to acknowledge the fact that indigenous people are not relics of the past. Indigenous people are still here. They're continuing to demonstrate and resist amidst a backdrop of ongoing colonialism and oppression. And we want to stand in solidarity with our indigenous siblings on this and every night and every day. This evening is also the anniversary, the 2-year anniversary of George Floyd. And I live a couple of blocks away from where he was murdered. And so we want to hold space for that and for all victims of police brutality and all victims of this continuous violence that we encounter in our communities. There are a lot of folks who are victims of gun violence and hate crimes and other things like that too. And so we're going to hold a brief moment of silence for not only George Floyd, but for Amir Locke, Dante Wright, the victims of the ongoing gun violences that are happening across our nation. So the 8 Asian American women who lost their lives in Atlanta and Atlantic Spa, the 10 Black grocery shoppers in Buffalo, the Taiwanese American churchgoers in California, the Dallas hair salon women, and the 21 children and teachers of the Texas elementary school shooting from yesterday. Our hearts and minds are with the families and survivors. May our hearts and minds and our thoughts lead to actions that change these things and offer us all healing. And so I would invite you to join us in a brief moment of silence for these folks. Thank you all. I hope that you continue to participate in community and healing and how we change these things that we encounter. So I'm gonna open it back up. And I don't know if I'm inviting you, Annie, to read some poetry, if I'm taking it back to Clarence, but Clarence, you let us know what's going on.
Yes, I sort of rushed through what we were doing because I am supposed to be a professional and I am, but not necessarily an MC. So I also want to mention that we're glad to have with us Sagirah Shahid, who is kind enough to join us for this event, and Sophia Epony Kim, who both of whom are very accomplished and talented writers, and they will be in conversation with Annie this evening. And thank you both for being willing to be with us tonight. And I've heard a little bit of your conversation already and what it's going to be like, and I think everyone else will enjoy it as well. So with that, I will hand it off to Annie, who I think is going to read some selections from her new work.
Thank you, Clarence. Yeah, and huge thanks to Sophia, Sagirah, Peter, Bailey, everyone at the East Side Freedom Library. I was just saying before, when we were in the green room, I guess you would call it, that I am just so appreciative that we got pulled together like this right before I'm, going to move to northern Louisiana and leave Minnesota. It feels very much like a gift to be able to celebrate my book with all of you tonight. I'm gonna try to change my view here so I'm not looking at, let's see. Okay. So Border Vista, the book. And before I start, I want to say a little bit about the title. So as Clarence mentioned, the book, many of the poems deal with being undocumented or precariously documented, but there are also, probably just as many poems, if not more, that are about family and about separation from my family, which of course is intimately tied up with immigration status. So I came to this country when I was 8, and for 17 years didn't see anyone from my biological family aside from my mom. And a lot of these poems were actually written in the wake of that first visit back to Cyan, which is my home city. That visit was in 2016, the same year that I began my MFA at Indiana University, the same year that a certain presidency began that put DACA, which is Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, the program under which I was able to work and have sort of semi-legal status in this country. That was the year when DACA really came under threat as well. So all of those forces sort of converged and were channeled into these poems. And so Border Vista, the title itself, is a technical term for a national boundary where the wilderness is so dense that it must be cut down in order for the border to be policed and surveilled. The particular Border Vista that I lived close to was the US-Canada one. And that one, there's a swath of 6 meters across through the woods where the trees have been cut down. And this is apparently visible from space, much in the same way that the Great Wall of China is. So that's the title of the book. I think that's what you need to know for now. Ars Poetica in a Dream Language. I dream my mother unravels hair out of my mouth. In English, she asks me to speak Chinese, coils the hair into a dark gloss, whorled in her palm. Fluency. I can't unhear my Chinese memories in English. Does that make them American memories? The word ravel means the same thing as its opposite, to entangle or disentangle, render incoherent or make plain. And now in this dream, she leaves me to muddle her hair from my mouth. A thin silk slick with saliva, I render into shapes that look nothing like her. Once, but no longer, ravel meant to waste, spoil, or destroy a thing, as by pulling a fabric into threads. If we allow for obsolete meanings, then let me also go back in time to the original state, examine at length or in a hurry, because what is obscure becomes obsolete, leaving a thin trail of threads. When I look back, I see the path, hair dark and raveling. This next one is called Memory in a Foreign Language. So my mom taught English in the Cyan Foreign Language School. And so that's the setting of this poem. And I think about English actually as just as much as the US as a country, English being the kind of destination to which I arrived. Memory in a Foreign Language. Weekday afternoons, I walk from school to the English class in the Foreign Language University. The air is the color of amber, or it is only this way in memory, which has stained it like a film remastered. Here, I learn a language is the way someone you love looks when speaking it. And English is my mother, moving her face in ways she does not at home. Long pursed O's, wide smile that's almost a grimace. The lesson underway sounds with the letter L. I mimic the sounds, my voice swallowed by the class. I stretch my mouth and feel the shape of what I don't yet understand, chanting lack, luck, lock. Lack, luck, lock. And what happens next, I don't remember yet. Switching gears a little bit now to the Vermont poems, the ones that took place near the Border Vista that I mentioned. Night swim at Shadow Lake. I can barely swim, but I don't tell them that. At the beach, the guys joke about leeches longer than my hand. They strip and hoot with pleasure as they leap off the slick rock. I keep my underwear on, feel my way in, the rocks first becoming dirt, then a soft sucking silt. Without my glasses, the lake surface gleams, oiled with stars. Someone told me once to imagine the water holding me up to the air, buoyant, but all I do is sink. The lake's long fingers plug my ears, grip me like a hand closing. Panicked, I plash back to the shallow muck and wait. In the car back to the farm, I sit with towels stuffed between my legs. No one tells any jokes. In the tensed silence, I realize they'd meant for me to take off all my clothes. I roll down my window, let in the night and its shrill insect trills, its sharp slaps of wind. My entire life, I have been afraid of the wrong things. One more Vermont poem. This one is called Permit. So one of the things that happened because I didn't have the right immigration status or didn't have a green card growing up, for instance, that was always the thing, the coveted thing, the green card, was also that I couldn't drive. And so it wasn't until I got DACA in my 20s that I finally was able to legally learn. Permit. I learned to drive in a blizzard. I was 22 and could finally legally work my job at the China Moon Buffet 30 minutes away from the 2-bedroom where we lived a mile from the border. He was 33, in the passenger seat of his $800 Forester, saying almost nothing as I inched up the snow-thick road. Who knows where the asphalt ended and the woods began? The packed snow beneath the tires made a noise like pressing and bending the pages of a book, the sound of something crushed against itself. He was always teaching me something. Even after I got licensed, I never considered driving away. Rereading these now, it occurs to me how much the border, even though it's not mentioned in a lot of the poems, is sort of this presence. And while I was researching the book, or writing the poems, I learned that something like 70% of people residing in the US live in the border zone, where ICE has sort of jurisdiction to stop people at will, or that they're just much more it's much more policeable. And it's only, I want to say, 100-mile zone that kind of comes in from where the border is, but because that's where so many people live, that accounts for 70% of people in the US. Okay, I think I'm going to read 3 more, 2 from the book. This one is Cyan Nocturne with jasmine and pears. I call my mother to tell her about a rare dream in the first language. The fruit vendor's miniature green pears, the soft juice I crave. She pays, but gets the wrong change. And I realize she can't read the words on the cardboard sign and doesn't know how much she is owed. She reminds me that the word for pear sounds the same as the word for leave. Li and Li. You're telling me I paid too great a price to leave, she says. Inflected differently, Li is Jasmine, my mother's namesake. How do I tell her that a week earlier, leaving my grandparents' home, an ambush of jasmine stopped me on the sidewalk, small mouths muted with grime, yet still sweet as a rain-dipped stone. I plucked one, tucked its velvet trumpet behind my ear. Now half a world away, my mouth empties. Every word sounds the same. I think Sagirah had pointed out that mouths appear quite often in the book, and now I'm thinking about that a lot as well. They are everywhere. So I had sort of the distinct, I guess, I don't know, pleasure, I just maybe the wrong word, but I was packing up all my books to move recently and found my undergraduate poetry thesis and opened it and looked through and really enjoyed seeing, you know, my poems from that time when I was first starting to write. And then there was an essay in the beginning that talked about how the poems came to be. And I had forgotten this, but my mentor at the time, David Kaplan, had assigned to me to write 3 sonnets and an elegy. And that's where that thesis began. I have since, you know, really abandoned the sonnet. I had a lot of difficulty with those 3 sonnets, but there is one poem in the book that sort of stacks 2 on top of each other. And the poem is called Transubstantiation Sonnets. So a little bit of an homage to that first mentor. Most days, you can't see the mountains surrounding our ancient city, but in any weather, you can hear the hiss of hot oil and the popped rice vendor's iron kettle cranked in an eternal circle. Once when I was 4 and sick, I spent days sprawled across the cool bamboo mat until sleep and wake became variations of heat and filtered light. Nai tied red thread to my limbs as if tethering a balloon to its weight. When the fever broke, I sat in Yeya's shoe and ate a crescent of watermelon, leaving glossy teardrop seeds to stick to his socks all day. It has been more than 20 years. None of this exists anymore. All my old neighborhoods are now demolished. Where are the bricks from the courtyard of my childhood that I ground into powder with a rock? Bent for hours over discarded remnants, I was tireless in my task, riveted by it until called away, palms powder stained, and satisfied at seeing one thing become so thoroughly something else. I can't see the mountains, but most days, bent and wrapped, I'm tethered still to this dust, to red threads I tie, retie. And then I'm gonna read one last poem, at least in this beginning part. We might come back to poems later as we talk. But true to the assignment of sonnets and an elegy, this is a new poem that I wrote that's an elegy for my grandfather, not for the Yeya who appeared in the last poem, but for Waigong, who is in some of the poems in Border Vista. Lake of the Isles, January 2021. After my grandfather died, I waited for him to arrive in Minneapolis. Daily, I walked across the water, wearing my black armband sewn from scraps, ears trained for his voice. Migration teaches death, deprives us of the language of the body, prepares us for other kinds of crossings, the endless innovations of grief. 49 days, 49 nights, I carried his name and a stick of incense to the island in the lake, and with fellow mourners watched as it burned a hole in the ice. He did not give a sign, but I imagined him traveling against the grain of the earth, declining time, spirit like wind, roughening whatever of ourselves we leave bare. When he was alive, he and I rarely spoke, but his was a great and courageous tenderness, so I'm told. Now we are beyond the barriers of embodied speech, of nationhood. Someday I will join him there in the country of our collective future, knowing that loneliness is just an ongoing relationship with time. It is such a strange thing to be continuous. In the weeks without snow, what do the small creatures drink? Thank you.
Thank you, Annie. Thank you so much. Hearing you read the poems, I have so many questions, and I think a lot of the audience would like to know how you came to writing and to poetry specifically. And then also, if you could talk a little bit about how this collection came to be.
Yes. So as I sort of mentioned briefly, I did write poems in undergrad. That was sort of my first experience with actually writing poems. Whereas growing up, I was really fascinated by fiction. I grew up in libraries. When I first came, I didn't really speak any English whatsoever, but my mom was an English teacher, and she knew that. She was like, what you need to do is read books, and you need to copy out the words and look up every word that you don't know in the dictionary and repeat it until you know it by heart. And so we were at the library all the time, and I just checked out books, starting with things like Clifford the Big Red Dog to like books about penguins, and just working my way up from there. So there was very much a way where that books were sort of my portal into understanding this new place I had come to, and was both escape and sort of entree into what it meant to be American. So I started writing, right around that time. She encouraged me to keep a journal. And these are both things, this reading books, looking up words that you don't understand, keeping a journal, are things that really feed, right, any writer. And I think for me, those are practices that I've continued. And so this book in particular, I think poetry for me seemed to be sort of the condensation of everything that I wanted and sought in fiction and in prose. I wrote fiction and nonfiction in undergrad as well, and there was something maybe about the musicality of poems, the immediacy and the nearness of them, the intimacy of them, that drew me in a way that was special. I was a pianist and a violinist growing up. Those were things those were my first loves. And I actually thought, I was like, I will die on this hill. I'm going to be a professional pianist. And that did not happen. But I do think that music and rhythm, basically these sonic qualities that poetry is so adept at and highlighting, is sort of what finally led me here. Yeah, and so these poems, basically I think came together, and the book, I guess I should say, started in 2016, I would say in earnest, when I was in my MFA, which for me was a really fruitful space, and where, people encouraged playfulness and experimentation. It felt like a very safe space to just try things out and to be formally strange and to try on different voices. So I wrote these, mostly between 2016 and 2018. And then for a year, I went back to prose before coming back to this collection, which once I sat with them, I think the biggest question was, well, I have these childhood poems, these family poems, there are these Vermont poems, and then there's sort of everything else. And in my head, I couldn't conceptually group them together. I thought these are maybe different projects, but I actually think that is that kind of separate thinking was a product of basically how I'd been trained to think about how books work, and I don't think is true, and was sort of a misconception that I had to see myself out of. And so once I began to talk to, friends and other poets about, well, what are the ways that these are speaking to each other? So in some ways, I think I was the last person who could tell, like, oh, this all can be collected together and they all speak to each other and belong in the same book.
I love, like, oh, Annie, I love what you described about that process of arriving to kind of that challenging the misconceptions of like what you expected a book to be. And I think too, I love that what you shared about escaping and the writing and the reading and that process early on with your mom and that entry, that foundation. And those two things actually lead into a question I had to you about, and we're thinking about breaking our conceptions of, you know, how we think about writing. I love like a lot of the poems that you have that touch upon memory and also like dream. It felt like there was a lot of dreaming, and I love that you talked about that musicality kind of driving your writing process. So can you talk to me about, I have like a silly question a little bit, but I want to know like if there are boundaries in your opinion between memories and dreams. A lot of the collection explores memory and dream in different kinds of ways. Can you talk to us a little bit about that too?
Yeah, I'm so glad that you noticed that. It's something that also struck me when I was revisiting the poems and trying to organize them. For me, I think memory is something that's so interesting to me. And I think it's one of those themes that's sort of inexhaustible and can be explored in so many different ways. I think in particular for me, it was strange to remember my childhood in English. And it was also, I guess in a way, I became, once I returned to China in 2016 and saw how much things had changed. I mean, pretty much literally every neighborhood that I knew and every place I was familiar with had been demolished to make space for high rises or for new developments. That coupled with my linguistic, like, I don't know, I guess clumsiness, or just how much I'd forgotten of Chinese, of Mandarin, how much I couldn't speak to my family members anymore, how much I didn't belong anymore, felt like they made this task of personal remembrance through poetry much more urgent for me. And so I think this revisiting childhood in these poems came from that urge to kind of, I guess, salvage them from this sort of linguistic blankness, this sort of linguistic black hole. And in a way, I think it was fascinating to me too, to see what could come out and what I could recall, what could break through the language barrier in my own brain. And the memories that did surface felt very dreamlike. It felt like a different life because it really was. And so writing from a place of dream felt very liberating for me also, because it mimicked that sort of the strange, surreal quality of my early memories. And it also gave me the freedom to not hew so close to life and to imagine differently. And to kind of move away from, even while staying in sort of the tone and voice of a confessional poem, it allowed me to move away from that as an actual practice of talking about my own life in a straightforward way.
I just want to add, your story about going back to China and visiting your hometown, right? That was basically unrecognizable. I think that very few people have that understanding. I mean, an understanding of what that can be like in Korea as well. So I lived in Korea for 2 or 3 years right after college, and then didn't go back for another 20 years. And it was completely unrecognizable. And it was so disorienting. And it also coincided with my slow loss of Korean too. And for those two things to happen I just remember standing on the street completely mute, just looking around and trying to orient myself. And at the time, and I'm still working on this novel, I was really struggling with trying to get back to a certain place emotionally that was from a period of time when I lived in Korea. But memory, and then at that time I had a dream, and in this dream, there was, you know how in dreams people may not be, like someone will show up and you know who they are, but their face is different, right? And so an old friend, I ran into an old friend on the street, and I was trying to get her attention, and she saw me, and I said, "Don't you remember me? Don't you remember me?" And she said, yeah, I'm busy. But she ended up being somebody else who was a character from a TV show that I'd been watching. And when I woke up, I thought, is this a sign telling me that my novel's gone? Or is it that it has to change? And then suddenly things started to change. And once I realized that I couldn't be just clinging so hard to a memory, that, I mean, memories are very, how do you say, like not concrete, you know? So I don't know, the connection between memory and dreams, I think, and writing is kind of hard to explain, but they all work together.
Mhm. Absolutely. I think there's also something about, so when I first actually studied neuroscience in undergrad, I really I thought that's the way I wanted to explore, like, the mystery of the human brain, you know, and memory really, and language. But one of the things I remember learning about during that time is how when we witness something, right, we have these mirror neurons that kind of in a way have our sort of imagined body perform the same task. And I think about that in relation to writing. And maybe that's why poetry feels so powerful to me, is because the poem itself should be an experience. And maybe that experience can is a bodily one too, one that can create the physical embodied reality of that memory or of that dream, when, in actuality, it's sort of this event that's only inside of our minds. And I think too about like how much memory isn't enough, right? That it can feed your work, dreams feed your work. But if I were just to transcribe a dream like that, I think, that kind of cliche of like, no one's interested in your dreams. And it's true, right? You can't just relay a dream. The poem has to do something else. And I think it's that the poem has to transform that experience or transform that memory or your relationship to it, so that when you're writing it or when you're reading it, something snaps into alignment that hadn't been before. And it creates an experience that hadn't existed before.
Can you talk?
Go ahead.
Can you talk about language you just talked about about Chinese and going back to China. In your last chapter, you use Chinese in your poetry, and sometimes you write it out phonetically. Sometimes you have the Chinese characters, sometimes you have the English translation right next to it. Talk about your choices in your poems.
Yeah, so that sort of, in a way, mirrored my own relationship back to the language. So after 2016, what was sort of remarkable, so I was there for 6 weeks, and over the course of that time, I found my relationship to the language changing. And even by the end of my time there, I was having dreams in Chinese for the first time since I'd been a kid. And that poem about the pears, I mean, that is based on a real dream, when suddenly I was like, oh, I had a Chinese dream. I was like, I have to immediately tell someone, and told my mom. But yeah, which is to say that after that visit, I sort of began to make a more concerted effort to become fluent again. And I also began to translate. That was something that I did at my master's. I took these translation classes. So as I spent more and more time in the language, and as that became more a part of my poetic vocabulary, it made its way into the poems pretty organically. I was also inspired by seeing other people who were using, languages that were sort of near and dear to them in their own poems, like Eduardo Carceral, or, many others. And I thought about how, so pinyin is what I use often. So, that's sort of you spelling it out using letters and the diacritical accent markings. That is such an important tool for me as a language learner, someone who's going back to that language, that I wanted to provide that in places where I'm using the Chinese word. And then there were other moments when it felt important to include the character. There's a poem that I didn't read, which maybe I'll read now, actually, but is, if I can find it, which includes the characters. And I think, to me, it was important to include that here because it was sort of, I wanted it to kind of mirror my own my own sense of like visual alienation from the space that I was in, and how little anything made sense. I'm sure a lot of you have had this experience where you go to a different place and the signs are in a language you can't read, and there's this feeling of helplessness, almost this infantilizing feeling of like before language even. Let's see. Okay, here it is. So the poem is called Jiangsu, Early Summer. He takes me, his adult child, swaddled in foreignness, to the southern provinces. Opaque scenes unfold, here among people with whom I once belonged. We walk streets lined with vendors and dappled plane trees. Everything I reach for, he buys. I record each parting hour for a while, lapse into silence. He is gentler than I remember, offering me a bowl of joe. His hands stumble. Father, recite this world to me. Yinhang, a bank. Yaxue, duck blood. Hutong, alley. Listening, I wipe our distance clean. So I think including the words in that particular poem, I wanted to kind of just bring them in as a way of even saying, look, I'm gonna keep these. These are mine now, I've learned them. But to kind of collect them more towards the end of the book, I thought about how the book itself can be a journey, a linguistic one, opening with, I don't speak Chinese anymore to my mother, and kind of making this realization of what's been lost, and finding, because those places will never come back, that time cannot be restored, even though poems are incredible at bending space-time. Like I can't actually go back to Cyan, but there is a way that we can return to language, and so maybe that's a hopeful way of thinking about the arc that the book follows as well.
I really appreciate that poem in particular, and the pairing, it being next to the pear poem with your mom too, as like a kind of, it felt like a really like intimate entry into distance and this intimacy at the same time, where you're getting so close to language, getting so close to that connection, but also there's these quiet distances in those spaces. And so I really appreciate you hearing it out loud as well too. I want to ask, actually, thinking about like different things. You mentioned that I talked about there was a lot of mouths happening in the poem, and we're talking about language, but I also noticed there was a lot of water happening, and I love that you read some of those water poems. And so I just wanted to know a little bit about, because a lot of with the water poems, I think a lot of the themes that happen in the poem or in the collection, there's a lot of in-betweenness. There's a lot of this transformation happen and fluidity. And I feel like that's a really amazing metaphor in terms of like what our minds and bodies do when we're trying to grapple with loss, trying to grapple with a loss of language and distance. And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit about all of these amazing water poems that also, I think in particular with some of the Vermont poems, they kind of talk a bit about these violences beneath the surface. So we're thinking about water as a place of healing, but also there's like this towing the line that water can be a place of harm as well too. So can you just, I know this is like a well-rounded way of saying, or a really circular way of asking, can you talk to us a little bit about this occurrence of water and this in-betweenness?
I love that you noticed that, because it was not something I thought explicitly about, but then once you brought it up, it makes so much sense. I think for me, water has a lot to do with, so the poem that I read, it's called Night Swim in Shadow Lake, where, you know, the last line is about being afraid of the wrong things. And my whole life I've had just actually like a fear of water. I had a hard time swimming. One of my first memories is being terrified of the ocean and not wanting to touch the water because it seemed horrifyingly huge and dangerous. But I think a lot of this book was me working through my relationship to different kinds of fear, and fear that felt useful in terms of keeping someone alive, and fear that was restrictive, and fear that would give you more tools from your own liberatory practices. So that poem felt instrumental in me realizing that when I was in Vermont, that was the first place where I was both kind of in touch with the land in a way that I had never ever been before. You know, I was working on a farm. I lived in a tent for a few months, and suddenly the elements were very, very foremost in my world, and we were swimming all the time as a way of even just cleaning ourselves. And I was so afraid of that. Like, there was so much to be afraid of in the world that I had never experienced. And but it wasn't until later that I realized that the different threat in the poem, which is that of sexualized violence, is so similar in that sense of like, how does learning about it keep you safe, and how does fearing it restrict your choices? For me too, there's a lot to be said about when I found out that I didn't have a legal immigration status anymore. Suddenly all I could think about was the fact that I was illegal, or the fact that I was deportable. And it sort of terrified me to the point of silence, where I couldn't, it's a really, I think, a common experience where the stakes are so high, you wonder, well, who can I safely tell? And it wasn't until I heard other people tell their stories that I realized, well, some of what I should be afraid of is also me not making connections with others, me not being able to speak about my life, and me not being able to live my life fully. Even publishing the poems, I now have my green card, but before I did, I wondered, well, should I write the book? Should I publish the poems? And I think there's all kinds of ways in which our own fears that once kept us safe can sort of begin to restrict us. And so water may be one of those. And I think the poem looks to that space as one where, yes, to be submerged is a place of danger, but it can be also a very fruitful space.
Anni, would you mind reading, I'm going to mispronounce this, but Hyphagonia?
Oh,
about agency with what you
Yeah.
shared, power dynamic.
Yeah, hypnagogia. So this is actually, speaking of sleep and dreams, this is that half asleep state that you reach. Another Vermont poem. Each morning comes with crows hacking at the house with beak and claw, crow babes in tow. Crows and their 3 knock caw, bluebirds in the badminton net, starlings iridescing the grass. And in the eaves of your study window, a colony of cliff swallows mouth mud and straw into nest. They want us gone, I think, shivering under damp quilts. His side of the bed hours empty. Crow calls echo in the empty house, follow me into dreams. Flies find their way in, die trapped against the glass, dry black carcasses husking the sill. When I sweep them up, their wings come free of their bodies. When the baby swallows hatch, every adult swallow in the colony takes turns bringing food up from the field. I take a cup of coffee up to his office, every step loud as a shot in the hollow parts of the house. The light from the window limbs the doorway, and when I knock, I can hear him sigh. Can the birds see him through the glass at work, shaping words into plays no one will perform? It is their home we live in, their nesting box of fiberboard and filmy paint. They surround us when we sleep, when we play catch with his son, surround us when our voices rise, when he pins me to the bed and holds me there as if underwater, and I see lights behind my eyes. He takes everything, my story, my bread, and my body, my trust in the universe. But what, if anything, does he take that I do not readily give? Outside, chimney swifts wheel above the fallow field, feet so small they cannot land, whole lives spent frenzying the air. Through the board-thin walls of the house, I hear the hatchling swallows, their hunger for everything the world would give.
I think this leads into another question that I have about, so your poems are really personal. They're very intimate. And I wondered what it's like to write about the personal as a person of color. And this question is for you too, Sagirah. Like how is the experience different for us writers of color when we write about violence? Yeah.
Sagirah, do you want to go first?
All right, I can. And Sophia, I would also love to hear your thoughts on this question too. I know that you asked it, but I'd be curious if we all answered. I don't know anyone else's experience but my own. So I know what I feel in my body and in my heart and my mind. And I'm very clear there are certain violences that I'm comfortable with wrestling with on the page in terms of creative practice and a healing practice for me in community. But there are certainly certain violences that I am very intentional about recognizing that I'm not going to perform my pain for anyone or make it a source of entertainment. And so I reserve the right to have that for myself and for whomever in my personal, intimate, private life to process that with. But in terms of when I do write about, when I feel there are certain violences that I'm comfortable writing about, it's always, the stakes are always high. You know, there's this sense, you know, being, I'm Black American, I'm a descendant of enslaved peoples. And there's this sense that there's a ongoing collective responsibility that we have to each other for our shared liberation struggles, right? And so there's this tenderness and care that I personally always am considering of in terms of my community and the stakes from not only myself, but that in relationships in my community. And I'm very always intentional in considering the fact of audience, like who is listening. And I don't want to necessarily cater to that, whatever audience. I want to be intentional about knowing who my audience is, which is my people. But at the same time, I recognize that other folks might overhear or may listen in on the works that I create as well. And so what are the stakes of that? And so I'm always, especially in a place in parts of Minnesota where I know for myself, sometimes I can be like the only person of my community in the space. I'm also Muslim too, so I definitely feel that depending on the audience as well. But in terms of the actual creative practice, it's been healing for me. A lot of my early entry into poetry was because I was in pain, and it became a source of healing for me to just write about it, and not necessarily share, but just write about it. But it's complicated. That's the short answer.
Yeah, I definitely echo all of that. And I think too, for me, it's been very healing. And I've sort of found myself working in less personal modes over time, like moving towards and away from that. But I think loneliness is such a central theme and subject for me. And so when I first started writing poems, I really thought of it as a way to have a conversation with myself and, you know, sort of change my relationship to what I was writing. I think what Sagirah said about like not publishing, you definitely don't have to publish everything you write. And so it's, I think, really liberating to always remember that, like, you can write whatever and it might not even need an audience except for you, and it might only need to change you, and that's it. But for me, at least, I think being able to share the work, I have to ask myself if it feels what the stakes feel like for that particular poem. And somehow I think in the process of writing, it feels like that, you know, some of the experience that get channeled into the poems, there's less sort of ownership that I have anymore over them. They sort of they have a sort of more, they have a life of their own, and I'm not sort of obligated to do anything else for them. And that feels sort of liberating in a way. I've also found that this book, in its short life so far, has already helped me have conversations that I otherwise haven't had. And other people's books do that for me too, right? That we can talk about things in ways that we wouldn't have been able to before because the work has found language for it. So to me, that feels like such a worthy risk to take. And I do know that it's sometimes the intimacy and the vulnerability that gets shared is not reciprocated or honored. But I think I have so far been so lucky to have that honoring be the majority of my experience, that I can sort of lead with that and be grateful for the community that it's helped me to build. Sophia, how about you?
Yeah, so you'd think I have a really good answer since I asked it, but I ask it because I've been struggling with it since I started writing when I was in college. One of my first experiences was writing a play for Theater Moo and declining having it staged because it was too personal. And I think maybe it's more prevalent in certain communities like the Asian American community, where we know there's a lot of violence, but we don't talk about it. And I think it's interesting what's happened recently with Netflix making, well, you know, like Korean soap operas are so popular right now, but almost every Korean soap opera that I've watched, they've referenced you know, domestic abuse. And then suddenly I realized, oh, it's actually, it's not a secret, you know, and it's not my shame to bear. But it's a process. I have, I don't know, it gets into the question of audience, and I think that more and more I'm trying to write for myself. And Sagirah, like you said, I will determine, you know, what I'm comfortable sharing. But before, when I was younger, I think that I felt like I had to do it. I had to write it because who else will? Because I think one of the reasons why we write is because we want to be seen. It's, I mean, not just me, but we want people who look like us to be seen. We want younger generations to see themselves reflected. One of your lines, loneliness is when nobody tells you a story about yourself. I think that's how it goes. And it was so beautiful. And I thought, I mean, loneliness is when you don't see yourself, you know, anywhere. You turn on the TV and everybody looks like somebody else. So there's a certain kind of responsibility, I think, that I always feel. But it's something that I'm always grappling with, like, why, what am I going to write about, and why, and how will I feel afterwards?
I just want to affirm like everything that you just said, and that's really, I want to sit with that for a little bit because that's really real. That loneliness that you're talking about and like feeling this pressure, it's like you want to say these things because the representation is not there. There's not enough of the stories happening, but at the same time, it's really scary. And so I just want to affirm that. Like I have a practice where I work with youth in poetry, and a lot of the work that I do with my youth is like the first thing is like affirming that you can speak up, like you don't, there's no like consequence for you speaking your truth and like sharing that and like creating the world that you're trying to create in this world of the poem space. And a lot of that processing of just what I feel like a lot of it has to do with some of the structural ways with which our folks are silenced, right, and experience different silences. And so even like inviting someone to imagine that there's a possibility for you to just, you can say it and it's okay, and to have that affirmation, that validation for youth, I noticed that is a healing practice that shows up. I wonder, what are some healing practices that you all incorporate with how you, if you have a mentor or like a learning practice, or even if it's with yourself, like what's the practice that you have to kind of get to that healing affirmation place? Perhaps, or any kind of teaching practice maybe.
I want to answer that question, but also what you said made me think of something else that I want to say before I forget, about sort of the stakes of speaking up and about audience, because that was also something I thought a lot about. And especially when there was this call, when DACA was being threatened, for undocumented people to kind of come out from the shadows, was the phrase, and to share our stories. And I did feel immense pressure at that time to kind of talk about my experience, especially because I think there was such a racialized way in which the undocumented experience was being framed, and it seemed extremely racist. And I thought, well, you know, the more that people realize that this is an experience that, you know, crosses all kinds of racial, ethnic, national lines, maybe then the less we can sort of, you know, use a racist rhetoric to kind of leverage the rhetoric of immigration. And at the same time, I think there's so much to be careful about in terms of knowing how our narratives might be consumed or used. And so I think it's just something to be very important, to be very careful about. That is very important. In terms of healing practices, for me, I think cooking and gardening are ones that are very dear to me, things that root me in my body and in sort of communal space. When we were at my MFA, we had a community garden where we would grow food together. And I think more than anything, having that kind of space where you can feed each other. One of the poems here is set at Bread and Puppet Theater, which was a place where I did an apprenticeship. And there, ethos is that art should literally feed people. And so there's bread and aioli that's served with every play that's performed. And that's really stayed with me since too. I think about, we must feed ourselves in order to keep creating and to keep building. So yeah, eating well and growing food with other people is always a joy.
I walk a lot, and I think that I read more translated literature almost entirely now, and I spend a lot of time with my family. I think those are the practices that help me. How about you, Sagirah?
I like to dance really terribly alone and sing the words out loud poorly. There's no judgment because it's just me. Sophia, do you also translate work? You said you read a lot of translated work.
No, I don't, but I read a lot of. And I translate on my own. I'm trying to read Korean very slowly. Yeah.
This is an incredible conversation. The territory and the depth is, well, nothing less than a gift to us. I do want to let some other folks in. There's so many things that I want to ask about, but I don't want to. I've said too much already, and maybe some of the wrong things. But I'm inviting people that if they have a question, if they want to type something in the chat, we do want to open this up. It's kind of hard to think of questions. I just want to say right off, there's been a conversation about this theme of water, and the line "I can barely swim," and my entire life I've been afraid of the wrong things, and you reference that, and it sounds so descriptive of the BIPOC experience in America. And it's interesting that we are writers, and we're talking about writing, writers, BIPOC writers, and it's like, where are the words? What are the right words? And what are the words that are going to tell people what they need to know? And then you talk about not being a good swimmer. And there's this thing that when someone is drowning, it doesn't look like drowning to other people. And it's almost like, are we in that place as we're trying to speak into this cultural space? What can we say that is going to mean what it needs to mean without, as Sagirah said, showing stuff, and all of you have said this, showing stuff that isn't really stuff that other people don't have the ability or competency or understanding to really know. I think that it's, we're always talking into a narrative that's framed by somebody else. And I think part of this conversation is reframing that narrative to make it more true.
Thank you for that, Clarence. I do want to, because I love reading works in translation too. I read a lot of Spanish language poems. I read them in Spanish and in English. And I read a lot of Arabic poetry. I read a lot of translated poems in general in different languages, but I'm like working through some Lorca recently. But I notice there's I just want to know a little bit about you all's practice with like translation or noticings that you have, because there's things that I notice where I'm like, that's an interesting way to enter the poetic with language in that way. And I don't translate things myself, but I would love to get to that place. And Annie, I know you translate things. And So can we just have a little bit of a conversation about translation as questions are coming in?
Yeah, I'm happy to say a little bit about that. I have translated less than I wanted to in the past few years, between, other things sort of rushing to the fore, but it's taught me more about writing than probably almost anything else. And I think I recommend it to anyone who has an interest to, just like we were saying, not every poem needs to be shown to the world. Even just doing translation as a practice, as a creative, as a writer, teaches you so much. I have basically focused on translating one contemporary Chinese poet whose name is Du Ya. And her poems really spoke to me because it felt like that we shared a sort of similar aesthetic DNA. And so I felt like I could maybe do her words justice in English. And I feel like, by my thinking as a translator is really that of the closest possible reader. You spend so much time with the text. It made me much more careful when editing my own poems. It made me think much more about what is going on the line level, but what is also going on holistically that I need to convey, and what's behind each choice that you make, and how it builds sort of the wholeness and the depth. Speaking of submergence, it's like, I think often of that idea of the poem or the writing being only the visible part of the iceberg. And I think in translation, that's triply true. There's so much that you have to sort of just suggest. So I definitely recommend it. And I also have done a fun exercise when I was teaching with students who, I would say, if you're having a hard time with a poem, or if it's seemingly a little bit that needs some life, put it through Google Translate, and plug it into a language that is, that Google is probably less good at, and then translate it back into English. And there will be some interesting changes that happen. And sometimes it's very fun or fruitful for your revision process.
I'm definitely gonna borrow that. That's amazing. That's like a whole prompt. I appreciate that.
A long time ago, I read something that Sam Shepard, the playwright, said, which was that all the most exciting literature that's coming out is all translated literature, for him, particularly from Central America. And so I started to read, that's how I started to read translations. And then I think I was really drawn to Korean translated literature because I think I read a lot. I'm always looking for something, some resemblance, something. And I find that in a lot of the African-American women writers, Gail Jones, Toni Morrison, Paul Marshall, but I haven't had that experience with Asian American writers. And then I started to read Korean translated fiction, and that really resonated with me. And there's so many wonderful books right now, but it also helped. It was almost like research in my life, to learn about my history and also understand about my parents and things like that. So it's a very personal thing. And I think one fun thing is when I read it in English, when I have those moments and I know what the Korean word is that they have translated it from, I think that's a really kind of, I don't know, it's this moment that makes me pause, and I love that.
This whole conversation actually just triggered a memory for me that I didn't think about, but it probably was underneath the surface of all of this. I think when thinking about translation, my love for poetry started with not understanding a language that I was learning. So I studied Arabic as a kid in terms of memorization of Quran, but we didn't always learn the translation in English right away. But when you recite and memorize Arabic, it's so beautiful. So it kind of trained my ear to pay attention to sound in a very particular way that definitely informs my poetry to this day. And so I think about how, and then later on, I also grew up in a Sufi household where we recite a lot of like prayers in Arabic and sing them. But I didn't always know the English meaning until way after the fact. And so it's interesting what the mind and body and spirit will do when you're noticing the beauty of a language and there's that distance and then you get into meaning. But it, yeah, that's all.
I'm glad you brought that up.
Yep.
It looks like there's a question
Yes.
or a request.
Would you like me to read it out for you? Or?
No, I've seen, so to read 6 years old, my classmates and I.
If you are willing.
Yes, I would be very happy to. Hi, Patrick. Very glad that you're here. Let's see if I can find the poem. This is the hardest thing about having a book, is remembering where things are. Okay, but that's why we have a contents. Thanks, Patrick. So 6 years old, my classmates and I. 6 years old, my classmates and I believe we invented this game of jumping from great heights, of punishing our bodies for their softness, as if by sustaining enough pain, we could be tumbled tough and world-proofed against hurt. I am young enough to still believe that old saying about eating bitterness. But there is one girl who refuses to play. Standing on the edge of the cement stage, she wears a dress the color of white fish, open on a butcher board. The skin on her face seems brand new, never ruined by sun, by exertion, by the gritty yellow dirt. She would have to learn how to fall. The crowd of our classmates gathers beneath us, their hard little faces like mine, smeared with snot and dirt, our red scarves a knot at our throats. My hands find her shoulders, pillowy and warm. All it takes is one quick shove. She's free of the stage and sailing, pale arms akimbo, soft whimper of surprise, to land face first against the ground. When the teacher reaches her, asking, "Who did this to you?" her voice is choked full of blood, and no one dares say that it is my name, she repeats like a drowned song. But I know it was me, it was me, it was me. Yeah, thanks for asking, Patrick.
Yeah, thank you for honoring the request. I wanted to mention, I have put in the chat the link to get a copy of the book. Of course, there are many places you can get books. We have a special partnership with Subtext Books, and we're grateful for not just that relationship, but their presence as an independent bookseller in our community. You know, if you do not have your copy already, get one from Subtext or your favorite independent bookseller. Yes, yeah, do it soon. I don't know, Annie, if you're going to be able to go over to Subtext and sign a few copies, but I know that they got some in stock just for this. So no pressure. If you want, I can go over there and grab them and bring them to you, but
yeah, we should talk. I would love to go there before I leave once more. Yeah.
Yeah.
If there isn't another question, I wanted to ask one more.
You wanted to ask one more, you said?
Yeah, do you see
please
any more
do.
questions? Okay.
Please do. Yeah.
Annie and Sagirah, what, for some of the new writers, young and old, give us a sense of what your life as a working artist looks like.
That's a really great question. I'm I would be curious to hear your answer to, Sophia. So I've only been working full-time after grad school for 3 years. Before that, I did kind of odd jobs, I would say, things that felt like dead ends before I even started them. And so it was easier to always have half a brain, like a poetry shark, thinking about writing. And now that I'm working at Grey Wolf and editing prose and kind of, often elbow deep in other people's creative projects, it is harder, I would say, to find psychic space to do my own writing. That said, I think people find ways, right? And it becomes a question of how important is this? Is it more important than these 3 other things that I really want to do? And for me, at least, it's because I edit prose and I'm writing mostly poetry, it still feels like this corner that I have to myself. And all of the reading that I do for work and all of the thinking that I do about what makes, a book satisfying, what makes it singular, how do we shape it to its best self? That's all work that has really helped me as a writer. I think much more now that I've worked with prose, I think much more about the structure of a book rather than an individual poem. I think that also comes from putting a first book together, because that was a whole experience. But I do think more and more I see writers who are in publishing and writers who are, of course, in all kinds of other fields. And I kind of love that in this particular, vocation, we bring all of ourselves to it. There's no kind of expertise that I've accumulated that feels wasted because it swims into the poems. There's so much fun vocabulary in every kind of other expertise that we might find ourselves drawn to. So I definitely think it's a way of, it's always ongoing. And I think you can do so much in even just 20 minutes a day. And I always remind myself too, to be easy on myself and forgive myself and not make writing feel like a chore and not feel tied to production in any kind of capitalist sense. So those are the things that I've been thinking about.
Yeah, I love all of that. For me, I grew up on welfare and Section 8, which is a government program to help with the rent. So I don't come from like a family with like money and all that kind of stuff. But as I came into myself as a writer, I've been writing for writing and publishing poems and works and thinking of myself as an artist for almost 10 years. And I've had a lot of different kinds of like interesting odd jobs in between. And I think at some point, maybe like 7 years ago, I kind of made a decision that I won't work full time somewhere, or I'll do part time where I can have the availability to focus on writing and other projects and stuff like that too. But that became that comes at a cost and sacrifice in terms of what I can do in terms of money I have available for myself. So it's been hard off and on. There have been waves and pivots, and I've had like a million jobs in between of like every kind of job, either nonprofit or customer service or whatever it be. And that has been hard. But because I'm in love with writing, I kind of commit to that. Right now, I don't have a full-time job. I left a customer service job about 6 months ago, and I've been living off of like grants and things of that nature and writing itself. I will probably go back into the nonprofit sector full-time, but I'm also in a place where I recognize I've been grieving a lot of personal loss and trauma and dealing with trauma in my personal life. And so I recognize that my brain just doesn't have the capacity to negotiate in the kind of way that I used to when I was a little bit younger, where I could, work a really stressful, intense job that demanded a lot of my mind, and then also come to the page. And so I had to give myself a lot of that grace that you were talking about, and just being patient, and also kind of looking at different approaches to the creative life, and being generous with myself, like acknowledging that like my ancestors, Lucille Clifton, for example, had all these kids and was like working and like had these small you know, didn't like separate, gave herself the space that she needed and the time that she needed, and made her life work around that, and, you know, influenced American letters or English letters in a really spectacular way. But I think for me, it's always an ongoing negotiation, and but I'm always, I kind of have sacrificed some things that I'm okay with sacrificing. My mother is disappointed in many different kinds of ways, but it makes me happy. And so if I'm happy and I'm whole and I can not be evicted, then I'm okay with that. I am interviewing for a job though, so holler at me if you want to hire me. What about you?
So I've been working as an artist. I was an actor for 25 years. And I've, like you've worked every kind of job, service industry job. Now, and then, you know, I'd always been writing, and what it looks like for me now is I do have the privilege and ability to stay at home and, you know, with grants and that sort of support, and also my husband. But I would say my life is much smaller. It has to be, in order to accommodate the amount of time and concentration that writing a novel requires. And I have a child and a mother that I care for. So those three things are about all I can do. But I'm working and writing every day. Just try to get to the computer is my goal every morning.
I feel like the fact that you're writing every day and getting to the computer every morning is like a win for us all. Like we need you to create and share your work. And I love that we were all honoring our creative practices. So shout out to us.
Yeah, thank you all three of you for this amazing conversation. We don't always get to have this kind of interaction and just real intuitive analysis of you know, the practice and the significance of what all three of you do in your writing practice. So thank you. It is after 8 o'clock. I feel like I need to excuse the class. It's kind of hard to stop this now, but I really appreciate, first of all, your willingness to join this conversation. When I asked, I was very hopeful that all of you would be able to join this conversation, and it is a privilege for the library to have the three of you in conversation with us tonight. I also want to thank everyone who was able to join us. Definitely appreciate it. At some point, this program will be on our YouTube channel, and I encourage you to share it and encourage other people to take a look. With that, I want to say good night, and hope that everyone can take this conversation not just to bed with them, but into the days that come after, because as you know, there are a lot of really difficult things happening, and I think it's an attempt to frustrate the words that our art creates. So keep talking, keep listening, keep writing, keep reading, and join us for more conversations. Thank you all.